This is African American History is American History. Welcome. I'm your host, Harlan Kearsley. This program's goal is to foster understanding, promote discussion, and expand knowledge through stories of historical events, bios of unsung heroes, as well as timely and relevant news stories which, hopefully, will paint a vivid picture of the effects of segregation, discrimination, and bigotry on the lives of both blacks and whites. Comparisons will be made between the many racially fractured periods of American history and what's going on right now. From assassinations to armed conflicts, from protests to pop culture, from activism to free love, 1968 truly was a pivotal year in American history. And with part 2 of 1968, the year of activism, the counterculture revolution continues.
In the 29th Congressional District.
Jerry, I'm sorry we're going to have to interrupt you. To Ray Williams right now to Kennedy headquarters in the Ambassador Hotel.
Right, Bob, and here we have a situation where Senator Robert Kennedy has been shot. The man is now calling for a doctor. We don't know exactly who did the shooting, how it happened. The rumor we have is that it was in the midst of some hysterical teenagers. A shot rang out. There was a noise. No one knew at the time whether it was a balloon or just what. But the senator has been shot. Exactly what his condition is, we don't really know. However, our producer has gone over to check and see if he can find out anything. But there is complete pandemonium here at the embassy room at the Ambassador Hotel.
On June 5th, 1968, having just won the California primary, which put him well within reach of securing the Democratic presidential nomination, Senator Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. He was leaving the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles after addressing a large crowd of supporters when he was shot by a young Jordanian immigrant named Sirhan Sirhan. Sirhan later said that he assassinated Kennedy out of concern for the Palestinian cause and had felt betrayed by the senator's support for Israel during the Six-Day War in 1967.
Here in the States, Republican Richard Nixon ran against Democrat Hubert Humphrey at a time of protests, riots, a very unpopular war, racial unrest, and deadly police violence. Nixon, much like Donald Trump 47 years later, ran on the law and order ticket. Nixon called his target voters the silent majority. And just like Trump did in his 2016 presidential run, launched a campaign based on fear and division.
On the evening of August 28, 1968, Vietnam protesters at the Democratic Convention in Chicago were violently met by the Chicago Police Department. Reporters, photographers, bystanders, and the protesters themselves all described their actions as a police riot. As the anti-war protesters peacefully chanted, quote, "The whole world is watching," the Chicago police, under the direction of Mayor Richard Daley, proceeded to beat, tear gas, and push some of the protesters through plate glass windows. This was all broadcast live on national television. It would later be described by the Chicago Sun-Times as, quote, "the Battle of Michigan Avenue." By the time it was over, 100 protesters and 119 police officers were treated for injuries, and 600 protesters were arrested. This reminded people of an earlier protest in 1968 that turned into a bloodbath. On the evening of February 8th, 1968, a civil rights protest in Orangeburg, South Carolina, turned deadly, with the death of 3 college students. The Orangeburg Massacre, as it would later be called, predated the Kent State shootings. Approximately 200 peaceful protesters had previously demonstrated against racial segregation at a local bowling alley in South Carolina. 3 of the protesters, all African American males, were killed, and 28 other protesters were injured. This is African American History is American History.
1968 also saw women of all races marching and fighting back against the gender stereotypes that confined them only to the role of housewives. In August of 1968, New York Assemblywoman Shirley Anita Chisholm was elected that state's Democratic National Committee woman. Shirley Chisholm also ran for the U.S. House of Representatives in 1968. She won by an almost 2-to-1 margin, becoming not only the first black woman elected to Congress, but also the only woman in her 1968 freshman class. During her New York legislative career, Shirley Chisholm faced more gender discrimination than racial discrimination. That's why the staff in her congressional office was comprised of only women, with about half of them black. It will be 4 years, January 25, 1972, in Brooklyn, New York, to be exact, before she formally announced that she's running in the 1972 presidential election. And with that announcement, Shirley Chisholm becomes the first black major party candidate to run for the President of the United States.
At the medal awards ceremony for the men's 200-meter race during the 1968 Summer Olympic Games in Mexico City, black American athletes Tommie Smith, who took the gold, and John Carlos, the bronze, took a stand for civil rights by raising their black-gloved fists during the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner. Peter Norman, the Australian who took the silver medal, wore an American Human Rights badge on the podium for support. The International Olympic Committee responded by banning Tommie Smith and John Carlos from the Olympic Games for life. Peter Norman's omission from Australia's Olympic team in 1972 was allegedly his punishment.
1968 saw increased government persecution aimed at the Black Panther Party. The party formed in 1966 and would reach its peak in 1970. The Black Panther Party's growth worried a dyed-in-the-wool racist like FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who described the party as the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. Hoover developed and supervised an extensive counterintelligence program known as COINTELPRO. This covert federal surveillance program used unlawful tactics designed to undermine Panther leadership, incriminate and assassinate party members, discredit and criminalize the party, and drain organizational resources and manpower. The COINTELPRO operation ultimately backfired on Hoover. Instead of weakening the Black Panther Party, the FBI's killing and arresting of Panther members only served to increase the party's support among African Americans and many whites on the political left. They valued the Panthers as a powerful force that was opposed to segregation and the military draft. The Black Panther Party's mission was to make the world a better place for everybody. While Hoover relentlessly painted the Black Panther Party as subversive criminals, the black community saw the party as a force for good. By the end of 1968, Black Panther Party founders Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale launched many social programs, including free breakfast for school children and community health clinics.
By December of 1968, an epidemic that began overseas in July had now become a pandemic and was hitting America hard. That's right, I said pandemic. It killed 100,000 Americans, And like the current COVID-19, this pandemic had its origins in China. But though racistly referred to as the Hong Kong or Mao flu, this pandemic never became a political issue. There were no shutdowns, no political battles over mask wearing, or protests by anti-vaxxers. Within 4 months of the pandemic, American microbiologist Maurice Hilleman and his team created a vaccine, and more than 9 million doses had been manufactured. In 1968, the phrase Southern Strategy was born. With the dismantling of the Jim Crow laws in the South, the Republican Party used fear and existing tensions to gain increased support with white Southern voters by appealing to the racism of Black Americans.
The GOP's Southern Strategy helped their candidate, Richard M. Nixon, win the presidency in 1969. It also pushed the Republican Party as a whole much further to the right.
And there you have it. Riots, mass shootings, protests, government surveillance, police harassment, racial violence, discrimination, voter suppression, a pandemic. It seems that when looking back at 1968 and comparing it to today, you can't help but say it's deja vu all over again. This has been African American History is American History. The episode you've been listening to, 1968, A Year of Activism, Part 2, was written and directed by Harlan Kearsley. The co-narrator for this 2-part episode is Kim Bay.
I'm Kim Bay. Thank you for listening.
And I'm Harlan Kearsley. On behalf of everyone involved with African American History is American History, thank you for listening. And if you haven't done so, please hit the subscribe button. It's free, and once you do, you'll be notified as soon as new episodes are posted. So thanks again, and please stay safe. African American History is American History. Copyright H.C. Kearsley, 2021.